for being here. As you guys know, so Mike has been on the Forbes Midas List since 2010 and was also named one of the 8 rising stars by Fortune magazine. And before becoming a full-time investor, Mike was involved as a founder and operating executive at back-to-back startups IPOs, including Tivoli Systems, acquired by IBM, and MOTV, acquired by Alcatel-Lucent. And some of Mike's investments include Twitter, Twitch, Weebly, Check, Bazaarvorce, Spiceworks, and a bunch more. And Mike is known for coining the term thunder lizards, which I'm sure he'll talk about today, a metaphor derived from Godzilla, and something that he uses to look for great companies. So Mike, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Let's see. So I'm going to kind of just plunge right in, and if there's a natural point in time to do Q&A, that's fine. You know, I'm probably not overly rehearsed, to be honest. You know, I guess when I step back, I think that a lot of people, when they get involved with tech startups, make a fundamental mistake. Well, 2 fundamental mistakes. One is they don't pursue exceptional enough ideas and people and opportunities. And then number 2 is they tend to follow the crowds rather than to think independently for themselves. And if you could become very good at always pursuing legendary exceptionalism and always committing yourself to having your own point of view and not having your reflex be to want to look like other people or want to do what other people are doing, if you can master just those 2 things, chances are you're going to have a top decile career, regardless of whether you're in startups or in big companies or whatnot. So from those 2 guiding principles, I've sort of developed a set of frameworks for thinking about how to build a company and how to invest in companies in tech. And so maybe what would be helpful is if I just kind of walked through what some of those frameworks are. Yeah, that'd be great. And in the spirit of thinking for yourselves, you can decide whether you want to pay attention to them or be contrarian to them. The first thing that I pay a lot of attention to is what I call the 3 exponential laws that animate tech. One of the things that is frustratingly counterintuitive to me is that we live our lives in linear ways. You know, we brush our teeth every morning, we drive to work every morning. Most of what we observe in the typical day-to-day rhythm of our lives is linear in its orientation. Most of our life is linear. We go to grade school, then we go to middle school, then we go to high school, then we go to college, then we go to grad school, and we try to go to the best one that we can each time and try to get the best grades that we can each time and try to achieve the most that we can each time. But the tech industry is animated by exponential forces. The first exponential force is Moore's Law. Probably many of you are familiar with that. Moore's Law basically states that the power of computing doubles every 18 months at a given price. Moore's Law is so embedded in our industry that we almost take it for granted. But the reason that Moore's Law is profound is that Moore's Law guarantees that there will be a new supply of innovative, disruptive, huge new companies in every tech cycle. No matter how powerful an incumbent is, Moore's Law is exponential. Give Moore's Law enough time and it will breach the incumbent advantage of any company in the world. No incumbent company can withstand the exponential power of Moore's Law when it is directly applied to disrupting its business. And Moore's Law and the entrepreneur's willingness to leverage it as a weapon is the asymmetric attack vehicle of the startup. A closely related law that is similar in nature is Metcalfe's law. How many of you have heard of Metcalfe's law? Okay, so fewer. So Metcalfe's law is a law of network effects. Bob Metcalfe was a co-inventor of the Ethernet, and Metcalfe's law states that the power of a network is a function of the square of the number of nodes in the network. And so, you know, network effect businesses leverage the fact that for every new member, that joins the network, the exponentiality and power of the network increases in a nonlinear way. Whenever I look at a startup, that's my first order question. In what way are you leveraging Moore's law and or Metcalfe's law to create an asymmetric attack vector to go after a new market opportunity? You'd be surprised at how many startups can't answer that question. And I'm like, if you can't answer that question, you kind of almost can't pass go, because there's no valid reason to believe. You know, the incumbents always have a huge number of advantages. They have customer bases, they have distribution, they have financial resources, they have people, and there has to be some type of a disruptive attack vector that they cannot counter for the startup to have a valid reason to exist in the market.
My question.
Yeah.
Question about it. Do you think that entrepreneurs set out to leverage these laws? Like they're thinking of their idea and they say, all right, is this going to leverage Moore's law or Metcalfe's law? Or do you think that they then get started on it and then think about how what they're doing leverages them?
I think it's a combination. But I think that you can always look back at these startups and point to an exponential force that they leverage, either in a pre-med or in a pre-med.
Okay, got it.
So I go back now. Are you guys okay?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, cool. The third exponential is more of an it's called the power law. And the power law states in a given set of outcomes, the largest outcome bigger than all the other combined outcomes. And the next largest outcome than the remaining outcomes, and so on. Power law like this. Biggest outcome looks like that. It goes like that. To give you a sense in action, in a typical startup year, 10,000 companies get started. The most valuable company is more valuable than all 10,000. In a typical startup, the most valuable company is more valuable than all created in that decade. Paul Graham at White said the most.
Yeah, we have a little bit of an audio problem now. I think is it is it possible to get closer to the mic on your end? I'm wondering.
Okay, I think I'm pretty close.
Or maybe we can mute ourselves for now.
Sorry about that. Yep. Is that better?
Yeah. So we're gonna try to mute ourselves for now until we have questions.
Okay, great. So just wave to get my attention when you want me to. When you want. Okay. So got it. Okay. So the power law is frustratingly counterintuitive. Most investing follows what's called a normal distribution. You know, you have a bell curve, it looks kind of like this, and you have kind of your middle of the road outcomes, and then your high outcomes and your low outcomes. That's not how venture capital works. That's not how startups work in tech. It is a business of extraordinary radical exceptionalism. So in what we found in our research is that the #1 company of a startup year generates half of the profits in the industry or more. And that the top 10 companies out of 10,000 generate 97% of the value in the business. So startup investing, in my view, is all about finding those top 10 companies of the year. There is nothing else. There is no other objective function. And I would argue that if you're a startup entrepreneur, the goal should be either to start one of those companies or join one of those companies. And I'm not saying that out of arrogance. I'm saying that out of humility. Why would you ever want to fight with 9,900 other people over 3% of the scraps? It makes no sense. And so it is irrational not to try to be involved with the top 10 outcomes in a given year. And so my whole investment theories and strategies and how I work with founders is all about how do you find those hyper exceptional companies, and how do you help them achieve their potential. And one of the heuristics that I use is I try to help founders think about what I call their value stack. And so value stack literally is a hierarchy of powers. At the bottom of the value stack is what I call proprietary power. Proprietary power is the thing that lets you avoid competition. I like to say it's more important to be different than to be better. And my view of how proprietary power happens is an entrepreneur leverages Moore's law or Metcalfe's law in a compelling way that's hard for other people to copy. So if you're leveraging Moore's law, it's usually you have a technology that very few people in the world can copy. If you're using Metcalfe's law, you're creating a network effect that if you get first mover and you execute well, you get scale advantages that nobody can compete with. So like when Twitter started to get scale, Google bought Jaiku, which competed with Twitter, but there was nothing Google could do to stop Twitter with Jaiku, because it wasn't about how much money Google had. It was about the network effect that Twitter was building. Similarly, Windows began to get a network effect in operating systems. IBM spent billions of dollars trying to beat them with OS2, didn't matter. Microsoft spent billions of dollars trying to beat Google search with Bing, didn't matter. So once a network effect is achieved, you can't throw money at a competitive offering. The network effect is too powerful. So that's proprietary power. Product power is the thing that delights customers about your product. You know, people talk in Silicon Valley a lot these days about product market fit, but in my view, product market fit is no longer enough. There's too many startups. And so I call it having a WTF experience. And so like for example, have any of you ever been in a Tesla self-driving car? Okay, so first time I ever did it, right? You double click back the cruise control stalk and it goes boom, boom, and starts driving itself. And like the first time, you know, we invested in Lyft in the seed round, and this was before UberX copied Lyft. First time I ever took a Lyft ride, I knew we were going to make a ton of money on that deal, because it was just like after you take one ride on a Lyft or an Uber, you're like, screw taxis. And so a WTF experience is so powerful and compelling that it not only is compelling to the customer, but it changes their point of view about what things should be. It causes them to never want to go back to the old way of doing it. There are a lot of other ways to achieve product power. We can talk about in the Q&A. But next level up is company power. It's the things that you do to enable the company to scale at a massive rate if your idea succeeds. It involves things like, do we define our culture proactively or do we just let it happen? It involves how we think about recruiting, how we think about compensation, how we think about the types of meetings that we have, the way we set goals, the way we empower people. One of my favorite elements of company power is what I call hot teams. And so when I was a kid, they started to study how NASA landed on the moon. And probably none of you was born before 1969. But just try to imagine that we landed on the moon in 1969 and HP hadn't even invented the pocket calculator yet. And got somebody back. So I became very interested in how the hell did that happen? Like, how did we do that? And I found this study on this concept called hot teams. And they talked about how some of the teams in NASA were 1,000 times more productive than a typical team. And so they wanted to know why. And so they had one example where some people had to put an antenna on the top of a mountain, and there were no roads to the bottom of the mountain. And so somebody on the team said, what are we going to do? We're going to miss our deadline. We better tell our boss that we're behind. And somebody else on the team said, if we tell management, you know, we'll never get this done. They'll just waste our time. They'll just gum up the works with red tape. So somebody else on the team says, okay, who has the biggest helicopter in the entire world? And they do some research and they figure out that it's the US Navy. So NASA calls up the US Navy and they say, hey, can we borrow one of your helicopters? We need to assemble this antenna. And the Navy says, you know, screw you, NASA, right? There are helicopters, you know, pound sand. So the NASA guys say, okay, here's the deal. JFK said we're going to land on the moon in 1969. And if we don't get this antenna up on the top of the mountain within the next 2 weeks, we're going to be behind on the project. We're going to miss the deadline. We're not going to land on the moon in time. And so then the Navy says, how many do you need? And so they loan them all of their big helicopters. So NASA puts all the parts of the antenna into these helicopters and flies them up to the top of the mountain and makes the antenna. And so the NASA moon landing was like 1,000 examples of that. And so hot teams are teams that feel extraordinarily empowered to achieve a mission that they are absolutely committed to. And what you have happen in a lot of companies is teams come up with excuses not to ship on time. Teams come up with reasons not to accomplish something. And what I learned from hot teams was a few important things. One is mission clarity. The goal has to be super important, and you have to believe that you can make it happen. And not only that, it won't happen without you. And it's not about performance reviews, and it's not about excuses or reasons. It's about, we got to get this done and we're doing it for each other. But the second thing has to do with how you empower teams. So the way I applied this thinking to the startups I worked with was I said, management can define the feature set of a product or the ship date, but not both. And so like we could say, look, it's got to ship by Christmas because it's a consumer product. But if we did that, then we let the team define completely on their own what would be in the product. And then conversely, we might say, okay, well, this is a product that's got to be mission critical. It's got to have this certain set of features. Then we let the team define the date that it had to ship. The reason that you want to do that is that a hot team, when they encounter obstacles, which they will, you don't want them to say, well, gee, this is totally unrealistic. Management gave me these features by this date. There's no way we could get this done. And then what they do is they spend time coming up with reasons not to get it done and arguing and debating about how unfair it is, or like how we should change stuff, or we need to have a meeting about this. Hot teams say, look, management told us we have to ship this by Christmas. We define the features. Yeah, we've encountered this roadblock, but it's not management's fault. It's our fault. It's up to us to fix it. We owe it to each other to ship on time. And like, I can't even believe it. We're having this conversation about not shipping by Christmas. And so hot teams have this empowerment. And the reason it's so important to have mission clarity in a big mission is it has to be important enough that hot teams will do whatever it takes to make it happen. And that's another reason that I want to invest in companies that I like to say the world is going to have a high give a shit factor about, because I know that those teams will do what it takes when they're empowered to kick ass and cut through the crap. And like, those are the kinds of teams that you want to be on when you're a developer. And those are the types of teams that you can recruit the very best people in the world to join. Okay, so moving up a layer is category power. Category power has to do with influencing ultimately the way people spend their money. Starbucks created a category for high-priced coffee. You know, the world used to believe you pay 50 cents for coffee. Now they somehow believe that you should pay $4 for a latte. Category kings are the people who define these categories and appropriate most of the money. The category king usually gets 80% of the profits in a category. Category kings exist not just in business, but they exist all over the place. Elvis was the category king of rock and roll. The other thing I've learned about category kings is they don't set out to disrupt, they set out to create. You know, Elvis didn't set out to disrupt jazz. He set out to create rock and roll. Elon didn't set out to disrupt cars. He wanted to create electric cars that were awesome. The great genius of Steve Jobs in his second tenure at Apple is he invented 3 categories: the pocket music player, the smartphone, and the tablet. But but category kings also change our point of view about, you know, what's possible as well. And usually they emanate from products that have a WTF experience. And so, like, my view is that when we work with startups, we're trying to help the startup become awesome at all those layers of the value stack through time. And by doing so, they're positioned to have a product that people love, that other people can't copy, that can be offered at great scale as the business scales its organization, and that then captures a dynamic spend and has, you know, a massive exit outcome. So other than that, there's about 1 million details, but maybe I ought to stop there if anybody has any questions.
Any questions from the class? I had a question for you, which is, you know, when you look for these frameworks, and you've talked, I think, about some of the companies that have already done very well in your portfolio. What are some of the companies that are just getting started or that you've just invested in that you think satisfies some of these conditions?
Yeah. So, and by the way, you never really know at the time. You know, you know, I like to make fun of people who are too certain about their knowledge, especially when it comes to startups. And if you want, I can tell some stories later on about startups that worked that I didn't think were working. That was pretty random. But I'd say that some companies that I've invested in recently that are showing signs. One is a company that's kind of stealthy called Origin. I'm a 3D printing skeptic for the most part, but these guys have created some software that lets commodity printers create output that looks as good as the output of $100,000 printers. And they've commoditized printers by open sourcing all the components and the software for the printer themselves. So, you know, if you're somebody in China, you can assemble one of these printers, and they're kind of trying to become the Microsoft of 3D printing. And I believe that in the world of the future, that people will 3D print more things than we anticipate. You know, everything from parts to screws to nuts and bolts to items that are manufactured in small lot sizes. So I think that this company has a chance to be very important because most companies are coming at 3D printing from the printing angle. And I think that the idea of commoditizing the printer the way Microsoft commoditized the PC and become the software that controls and powers it all could be pretty interesting.
So does that company have both the network and technology advantages?
Yeah, they have their technology advantage is their software is just extraordinarily kick-ass, and they just have a lot of proprietary know-how about how to write this software. It turns out that there's a very small number of people in 3D printing who really know how to write the best software. And so I've basically been finding all those people and saying, come to Papa, and trying to get them all in the same company. And so, and I feel like if I can do that, then all the other great people that emerge who write kick-ass software will want to come work with these people. So it's a little bit like my early days of Silicon Graphics. You know, 15 of the top 20 best graphics software programmers were at SGI, and 10 of the top 15 of the best hardware guys were at SGI. And so everybody who wanted to be involved with just absolute kick-ass insane graphics, Silicon Graphics is kind of like Mecca, right? That's where you wanted to be. So I think that we're succeeding at getting the very best minds in 3D printing software. The other thing I like about it, though, is it's kind of a contrarian play to say the hardware shouldn't matter someday. In fact, let's give the hardware away. You know, Carbon charges huge amounts of money for their proprietary materials that work only with their $100,000 printers. Let's give the recipe for materials away. Let's give the specs for the printer away. Let's give the software for the printing away, but then have our software integrate with every single 3D CAD package in the world and have a button that says print to origin. And then it can print at an arbitrary level of quality. And so on any of these printers, wherever they exist in the world. So I like that company. I have no idea if it's going to work. It's hugely risky. It's like got 5 people right now. but I'm excited about that one. I'm excited about the idea of applying mapping technology to enterprise software, not just consumer. So I'm seeing a few enterprise software companies that are doing interesting things there. But they all look crazy early and risky in the early days. They can go in 1,000 directions.
And you talked about your 97. Well, the 97% of returns is generated by 10 companies every year rule. You've had a couple funds right now. Can you give us some examples that just sort of crystallize that rule in terms of your portfolio of the companies that have delivered these outsized returns compared to other ones, and like what multiples those represented?
Yeah. So the first fund I ever did was my own money, and it had some good companies in it. It had Twitter, it had Dig, it had Aggregate Knowledge, it had Yumi Networks, and it had what was the other one? Vizu. Vizu ended up, we made 5 times our money. Dig went out of business. Aggregate Knowledge got bought for $150 million. Yumi went public. Twitter went public. But what's interesting is the fund would have been a 5 to 10 times fund without Twitter if I'd done just those other deals. Twitter made 500 times. And so all the other ones could have gone to zero. And really all that mattered was that I invested in Twitter. Because in a fund that had 7 or 8 investments, you have one that does 500 times, it just, everything else could go to zero. Maple's fund, the next fund that I did had Demand Force in it. Demand Force returned 3 times our first fund by itself. Lyft is worth 3 times fund 2 or fund 3. In venture, it's weird, just your best outcomes are just these extreme outliers that cover up all your other sins. And, I just almost don't think you can exceed in venture unless every fund has 1 or 2 companies like that just have the explosive breakout potential and realized outcome.
And looking back now, what was the common point between all of these outliers, how you initially felt about them, or maybe some things in common apart from the frameworks that you've talked about, whether it be with the founders or with the companies themselves? Have you found that there's something that links all of them?
It's funny. I'd like to think that I can. So I guess my view is that people tend to think they know more than they know. And particularly the more exponential and random an environment is. And so what I try to do is I try to come up with frameworks to cope with my ignorance. And so I kind of look at it like we're all ignorant about these forces. And that what we need are tools that allow us to avoid making rookie mistakes that rely on our intuition, where we have uninformed intuition, right? So the reason I pay attention to exponential laws and the reason I pay attention to the value stack framework is if I find a company that violates too much of that, I move on. But I like to say that, I'm spotting these companies when they're at the atomic, I like to call them thunder lizards. And the thunder lizards, the metaphor comes from Godzilla. Godzilla was hatched from radioactive atomic eggs, swam across the ocean and destroyed cities, breathed fire on buildings, swiped holes in things, ate train cars like they were sausage links. And I like to say my job is to spot atomic eggs. And I allow myself to relax about what it might mutate into, because I don't really know, right? But what I have to do is I have to look at startups that have super high potential energy and that are kind of setting off my Geiger counter with a lot of factors. But then I'm sort of willing to live with the ambiguity of what it's likely to become. So, Twitter, before it was Twitter, was Odeo, which was a podcasting company. And here's a story to show you how random it is. I invested in Justin.tv when it was Justin Can. He walks into a coffee shop with a baseball cap and a camera on his head and wires going into a backpack full of hardware. I mean, it almost looked like we were gonna have to call security. And I say, Justin, what are you doing? And he says, I'm live casting my life. And I'm like, Justin, come on, that's stupid. And he's like, no, I'm live casting my life. And I'm like, well, how do you even do that? And he says, well, the internet's a hostile networking environment. And, you know, you have to do a bunch of things to make live video stream over the internet. This is back in 2007. And I said, look, I think this business idea is stupid, but I think that technology is really cool. And I think that live video on the internet's going to be a thing someday. And so I'll give you some money to go try this. So a couple years later, I get an email from him and he says, great news, we're pivoting. And I'm like, okay. And he goes, we're pivoting into two new companies. And I'm thinking, oh boy, this doesn't sound good. And he says, one of them's called Social Cam and the other's called Twitch.tv. And Social Cam and Twitch.tv made absolutely no sense to me. It made even less sense to me than Justin.tv. Social Cam ends up getting bought 6 months later for $70 million. So we made 10 times our money. And so I thought that was the company. And so I just forgot about Twitch and didn't even remember I was a shareholder. And 6 months later, I'm downstairs in the basement hanging out with my son, and he's on Twitch. And I'm like, huh, gosh, that name sounds familiar. And I'm like, tell me about this Twitch thing. And he's like, oh, all my friends are on it and blah, blah, blah. He's like, you should have invested in it, Dad, because I think this is going to be big. And I'm like, man, Twitch. And so I'm like, man, mate, gosh, let me go back through my emails. And so I Google search Twitch.tv in my Gmail. And sure enough, I'm a shareholder in Twitch. So I send Emmett Shear an email and I'm like, hey, Emmett, I just want to confirm the number of shares I have because I didn't know how many shares I had. I'm just doing some admin clerical work and just how many shares do you think I have? I want to see if it matches the number I think I have. And that's okay. Here's how many shares you have. And I'm like, great, that's what I thought. And then 3 months later, the company gets bought by Amazon for $970 million. And we made 84 times our money on that one. And so there are days like that you wonder, what business am I even in? But you know, if I deserve any credit for that investment, it was, you know, sort of recognizing the exponential potential energy of the original idea, but not getting too hung up on how linear is the path to getting to, you know, product market fit. So I tend to like founders who are playing with weapons grade plutonium, but we haven't quite figured out what the weapon is. But like in a portfolio of 25 of those, only a few of them have to work for us to make good money because the ones that work spectacularly.
Does that mean that there are a lot of companies that you will pass on because they're good and you think they'll make 10x or 20x, but that they're not plutonium and that they won't sort of explode and become a 1000x company?
Correct. And so one of my advantages is, since I care about exponential, I can eliminate 9/10 of the pitches that come in and say, this isn't for me. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to ask, how can you tell if a company is only going to be 10 or 20x?
Well, you can't. I mean, like what happens a lot of times is you'll get a pitch that makes a lot of sense on paper. They'll say, okay, here's a customer. They have this pain point. We solve the pain. We save them money. We sell it direct. You know, here's the valuation you can invest at. You make 10 times your money if the company sells for $75 million. And I'm not interested in those, right? I'm interested in, this is a capitalist mutation, and it's probably going to be worth 0, but if it works, we're going to make 100 times. And we don't even really know how we're going to make 100 times, but we know that this has disruptive breakout potential, and it's so crazy it might work.
Got it. You earlier we chatted for a couple minutes before this, and you mentioned that you passed on some very successful companies. Did those companies satisfy the frameworks that you had, or I suppose did you not realize that they did, or did they only satisfy those after?
Well, that's the problem, and some of these frameworks I developed through time, through trial and error, right? So, and we can come back to that topic as well, because I think that most people, they make the mistake of not improving how they think over time. But so let's talk about the ones I passed on. The guys from Airbnb came into our office. At the time, it was called Air Bed and Breakfast. They were two guys. They came in with a bunch of cereal boxes, Obama O's and Captain Cane McCrunch. And I was like, hey guys, I thought you're Air Bed and Breakfast. What's up with these cereal boxes? And they said, well, we haven't been able to raise money. So the way we've funded the business so far is we've sold these because it's the election between McCain and Obama. And I was like, okay, that's not so confidence inspiring, but oh well. And so I'm like, okay, what does Air Bed and Breakfast do? And they say, okay, here, check it out. Here's what happens. Somebody rents you a room in their house and they give you an air bed, and then they serve you breakfast the next morning. Air Bed and Breakfast. And I was like, okay. And I was like, and what's your distribution strategy? They're like, we're going to blow up at the Democratic convention next week. Not enough hotels in Denver. We're going to blow up. And so, like, to our credit, I suppose, I was like, okay, this is crazy, but this is my kind of crazy. And so how about this? Let's schedule a call for Monday after the Democratic convention. And I want to walk through what your learnings are from the Democratic convention and like whether there's a potential network effect to this. Well, they blew up at the Democratic convention, and Sequoia Capital was monitoring them and tracking them, and they gave them a term sheet before it did Sequoia's deal. And by the time Monday after the Democratic convention came, it was too late. And so I lost that one. That one hurts because I don't feel like I was being a bozo there. Pinterest, and my partner, Ann Miraco, comes into my office one day and says, I've made a terrible mistake. I've passed on Pinterest, and it's going to be big. And I said, what's Pinterest? Like, I'd never heard of it. And she's like, you know, it's starting to really take off, especially among women. I think it's going to be big. I think we should go in there and just like go, you know, full metal jacket trying to win Pinterest. So she calls up Ben and she says, I'm pregnant and you got to take another meeting with me. If you don't, I'm going to go on a hunger strike. And so Ben's like, okay, no, don't go on a hunger strike, Ann. So we go meet with Ben. And I've rarely had this happen before. It's happened probably 2 or 3 times. But like when you're in a first meeting with a founder and you're like, it's just totally obvious to you, this is going to be huge. I mean, I remember sitting there with Ben thinking, this is going to be, this guy's going to be famous someday. He's going to be on the cover. He's going to be one of Time's 100 influencers. This thing is going to be massive. So we offered him a term sheet that day. It was the most expensive deal we'd ever done, the biggest offer we'd ever made. And Ben calls me up and says, look, you know, I'm sorry, but you're just not even close. And I'm like, Ben, but you know, we're only diluting you 5% and we're giving you this great deal, this high price, and we're putting all this money in. And I mean, who's going to dilute you less than us? And he's like, you know, just trust me. You know, if you knew, you'd understand. Well, Mark Andreessen gave him $20 million at 200 pre. and our offer had been 5 at 75 post. And so he took Andreessen's deal. And then I ran into Mark a few weeks later, and I said, dude, you know, why are you blowing me out of these deals like this? You know, you're just crushing me. You know, what's up with that? And he's like, oh, I didn't know anything about it. You know, if you had told me that you were interested in Pinterest, we would have made room for you. And I thought he was BSing me. So when GitHub came along and I found out that Andreessen's going to win GitHub, I called up Mark and I said, all right, you know, did you mean that? Because GitHub was one I saw back in 08. I could tell that story, how that got away too. That one hurts too. But Andreessen goes, no, I wasn't BSing you. I'd be happy to let you in on this GitHub deal. Mark and Ben, when we launched Floodgate, actually sent us a coffee maker to congratulate us for launching. But so I said, okay, I'm interested in GitHub. And I said, what are the parameters of the deal? He said, 50 million at 750 post. And I said, $750 million, that's outrageous. Like, that's just too expensive. And he's like, well, don't ever say I'm not letting you in on these things. And I was like, well, you know, that price is outrageous. You've lost your mind. And he's like, well, you know, do you want to do it or don't you? So I decided not to do it, but yeah, but at least he kept his word. Yeah, so that one hurt. I passed on Zynga. Got very close to doing GitHub in 08. But then we scared him off. Yeah. So for every one we've done that worked, there's been plenty that didn't.
Got it. But it seems that those that you passed on, like, at least you were sort of like, it was not a total pass, and you saw something in there.
Usually, or you know, whenever a deal works or doesn't work, I try to do a post-mortem. And then similarly, when a deal works that we didn't do, I try to do post-mortem. And what I've learned is that people tend to be too confident of their knowledge of what's going to happen. There's a book that I like that came out recently called Super Forecasters, and it talks about how amateurs can almost always beat experts at forecasting if they're humble enough to continuously check and refine their assumptions. And so the value stack and a lot of the frameworks that I put together came largely out of coming up with tools to cope with my ignorance over time.